Seattle, November 1969. Al Hendrix sat in his small living room on South Jackson Street, newspaper folded in his weathered, work-calloused hands, listening to the radio play another one of his son's songs. Purple haze filled the modest two-bedroom house where Jimmy had grown up, where he'd first picked up a broken ukulele at age 9 that Al had found at a pawn shop downtown, where Al had told him countless times over the years to turn that damn noise down before the neighbors complained. Al reached over and turned the radio off with more force than necessary. He'd never understood it. The screaming guitars that sounded like metal being torn apart, the feedback that made his teeth ache and his neighbors wince, the volume that seemed designed to assault rather than entertain audiences. To Al, it wasn't music at all. It was expensive, famous noise that somehow made his son rich and admired around the world. But noise nonetheless. Real music was what they played at Mount Olive Baptist Church on Sundays, what his beloved Lucille used to hum while cooking Sunday dinner in this very kitchen. What came from the heart without needing amplification loud enough to wake the dead or make teenage girls scream and faint at concerts. Jimmy was coming home for the first time in over 2 years. The phone call 3 days ago had been brief and somewhat awkward, like all their conversations since Jimmy had become a famous household name. "I'll be in Seattle next week. Thought I might stop by." No warmth, no excitement, just obligation disguised as consideration. Al had complicated feelings about the upcoming visit. Pride, certainly. His son was famous, more successful than Al had ever imagined possible. But there was distance too, a growing gap that widened with each album, each tour, each magazine article that painted Jimmy as some kind of mystical guitar god that Al couldn't reconcile with the boy he'd raised. The neighbors knew, of course. Everyone in the Central District knew Al Hendrix was Jimi Hendrix's father. They'd started treating him differently after Jimmy became famous. Some with awe, others with barely concealed suspicion, all with curiosity about what it was like to be the father of someone the whole world seemed to worship. Al never knew how to answer their questions. What was it like? It was confusing. It was watching your child become someone who existed more completely for strangers than for family. Al had worked construction his whole life, building houses and office buildings that would stand for decades. He understood honest work, tangible results, creating things people needed. Music, especially Jimmy's kind of music, seemed ephemeral, frivolous, not quite real. When people asked him about his son's career, he'd say, "He plays guitar," with the same tone he might use to say, "He juggles." The doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon, as Jimmy had promised it would during their brief phone conversation. Al opened the front door to find his son standing alone on the familiar porch, where he'd spent countless summer evenings as a child, carrying a black leather guitar case that looked expensive and well-traveled, and wearing clothes that looked like they cost more than Al made in a month. Bell-bottom jeans, a colorful paisley shirt with flowing sleeves, and custom leather boots that had probably walked on stages across Europe and America. No entourage, no camera crews, no managers or hangers-on trailing behind him like he'd seen in magazine photographs. Just Jimmy, looking somehow smaller and more fragile than he appeared in all those concert photos. His famous afro less dramatic in person, his eyes holding a wariness and exhaustion that Al didn't remember from their last visit 2 years ago. "Hey, Al," Jimmy said quietly, using the name he'd always used instead of Dad. "Son," Al replied, stepping aside to let him in. They hadn't hugged in years. Al wasn't sure when that had stopped happening, but physical affection had become another casualty of fame and distance. Jimmy looked around the living room with careful attention. The same couch where he'd practiced guitar for hours as a teenager. The same photographs on the mantelpiece, including one of his mother Lucille that Jimmy always studied whenever he came home. Nothing in the house had changed much. Al wasn't one for redecorating. The furniture was the same, the layout unchanged. Even the smell was familiar. Coffee, old wood, and the lingering ghost of Lucille's perfume that Al swore he could still detect 15 years after her death. "Coffee?" Al asked gently. "Sure," Jimmy replied. They sat at the small Formica kitchen table where Al ate his breakfast every morning while reading the Seattle Times, where he paid his monthly bills with careful attention to every dollar, where he'd tried for years to convince teenage Jimmy to focus on his schoolwork instead of spending every free moment with that guitar. The same table where they'd had countless arguments about Jimmy's future, about the importance of having something to fall back on, about the slim chances of making it in the music business. The wood grain pattern was worn smooth in places from decades of daily use, marked with coffee rings and knife scratches that told the story of a working family's daily routines. The conversation felt awkward and stilted, like two strangers making polite small talk. Two men who shared a last name and some DNA but seemed to inhabit completely different worlds now. Al asked about the tour, about travel, about the business side of music that he thought he should understand, but didn't really. Jimmy answered politely but without much detail, giving the kind of measured responses he probably gave to reporters, revealing nothing while seeming to say something meaningful. "Tour going well?" Al asked carefully. "It's fine," Jimmy replied. "Tiring. Different cities every night." "Making good money?" Al asked quietly. "I do okay. More than okay, actually." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the wall clock. Al studied his son's face, looking for traces of the boy he'd raised, but Jimmy seemed distant, unreachable. "I still don't understand it," Al said finally. "The music, I mean. All that noise and screaming. Don't see how people can call it music. Sounds like machinery breaking down." Jimmy nodded slowly, without defensiveness. He'd heard this critique before, not just from Al, but from critics, older musicians, anyone who believed music should follow certain rules. "Maybe that's the problem," Jimmy said softly. "You've never really heard it." "I've heard it plenty," Al replied. "Radio plays your songs all the time." "No," Jimmy said, standing up. "You've heard the recordings, the produced versions, but you've never heard the music itself." He walked to the living room and opened his guitar case. Inside was an acoustic guitar, not one of the wild electric guitars he was famous for. Just a simple Martin D28, natural wood finish, the kind of guitar that demanded honesty. Al watched from the kitchen doorway as Jimmy lifted the guitar with reverence, sat on the edge of the couch and began tuning it by ear. The process was meditative, almost ceremonial. Jimmy's fingers moved with the same precision Al had seen him use as a child fixing broken radios. "This song," Jimmy said quietly, "is for Lucille." He was talking about his mother, who had died when Jimmy was 15 and left both of them struggling to understand how to be a family. Jimmy's fingers found the opening notes of Little Wing, but this wasn't the electric version radio stations played. This was something different entirely, softer, more intimate. The guitar became an extension of his voice, each note carefully chosen. "Well, she's walking through the clouds," Jimmy sang, his voice barely above a whisper, with a circus mind that's running round. Al had heard this song before, but not like this. Without the full band, without production, the words became clear, the melody became intimate, the emotion undeniable. "Butterflies and zebras and moonbeams and fairy tales," Jimmy continued, his fingers moving across the strings with supernatural dexterity. Al found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in years to something his son was playing. The song wasn't about butterflies and zebras at all, wasn't about whimsical fantasy creatures or children's fairy tale imagery. It was about something else entirely, something much deeper and more painful and more beautiful than the surface words suggested. It was about loss and memory and the way people we love continue to exist in the spaces between musical notes, in the silence that follows the last chord, in the echo that remains in our hearts long after everything else has gone quiet. As Jimmy played, his fingers moving with practiced grace across the steel strings, Al found himself transported back in time, thinking about Lucille and all the small moments he'd forgotten or tried not to remember. How she'd always hummed while she cooked Sunday dinner in the kitchen, just a few feet away from where they now sat. How she'd sung gentle lullabies to Jimmy when he was small and couldn't fall asleep during Seattle's long summer evenings, when the lights seemed to last forever. How she'd encouraged Jimmy's music even when Al thought it was a waste of time that would never lead to anything practical or useful, anything that would pay bills or provide security. She'd seen something in those early, clumsy attempts at guitar that Al had dismissed as typical adolescent distraction, something that spoke to a deeper understanding of how raw emotion could somehow be transformed into organized sound, how personal feelings could become melodies that other people could hear and understand and feel in their own hearts. And when she flies away from here, Jimmy sang, his voice cracking slightly, revealing human vulnerability beneath the public persona. The guitar seemed to sing along with him, the wood resonating with frequencies that went beyond technical proficiency. This wasn't showing off. This was communication at its most essential level. One human being sharing his inner experience through organized sound. Al realized his eyes were filling with tears. Not just moisture, but deep, chest-shaking emotion he hadn't allowed himself since Lucille's funeral. This song wasn't about fantasy creatures. It was about his wife, about the hole her absence had left that neither of them had learned to fill. When she flies away from here, Jimmy sang, and the phrase hung like a prayer, like a promise that some things transcend physical death. The song ended, but Jimmy let the final chord sustain, allowing it to fade naturally. The house fell into complete silence except for Al's quiet crying, years of suppressed grief finally finding expression. Jimmy set the guitar down gently. He didn't say anything immediately, didn't try to explain what had just happened. That, Al said finally, his voice breaking, that was your mother. Jimmy nodded, his own eyes bright with tears. Everything I play is her, in some way. The loud stuff, the quiet stuff, all of it. She taught me that music isn't about the instrument or volume. It's about what you put into it, what you're trying to say about being human. Al walked to the couch and sat next to his son, closer than they'd sat in years. The physical distance seemed symbolic of everything that had grown between them, but suddenly that gap felt manageable. I owe you an apology, Al said. I never understood what you were doing. I thought it was just noise, just showing off. I wanted you to build something solid, something I could understand. You wanted me to be safe, Jimmy replied without accusation. You wanted me to have security. After we lost her, you were trying to protect the only family you had left. But this is real work, isn't it? Al asked, gesturing toward the guitar. This is building something, just not with hammers and nails. Jimmy smiled, the first genuine expression Al had seen since he'd arrived. It's the hardest work I've ever done, and probably the most important. When I play for people, I'm trying to give them what that song just gave you, a way to feel things they might not have words for. They talked for another 2 hours, really talked for the first time since Jimmy had become famous. Al asked questions about songwriting, about what it felt like to play for thousands. Jimmy answered honestly, sharing stories about the loneliness of touring, the responsibility he felt toward his audience. When Jimmy prepared to leave, he carefully placed the acoustic guitar back in its case. He stood and looked around the living room one more time, taking in the photographs, the familiar furniture, the sense of home. I want to come back more often, Jimmy said. If that's okay. I'd like that very much, Al replied. They hugged goodbye at the front door, a real embrace, the kind they'd shared when Jimmy was young. Al felt his son's arms around him and realized how much he'd missed this simple connection. I love you, son, Al said, surprising himself. I love you too, Jimmy replied. Thanks for listening. Really listening. Al watched from the porch as Jimmy walked to his car, guitar case in hand, moving with a lightness that hadn't been there when he'd arrived. 3 months later, on September 18th, 1970, Jimmy was dead. Al kept the story of that November afternoon private for nearly 20 years, carrying it like a secret treasure he wasn't quite ready to share with the world. When journalists and music historians came around asking about his relationship with his famous son, wanting quotes for their articles and documentaries and books about the legendary guitarist, he'd give the same carefully measured responses about being proud of Jimmy's achievements, about knowing he was talented from an early age, about missing him terribly every single day since his death. But he never talked about Little Wing, about that quiet acoustic moment in their living room, about the afternoon when everything he thought he understood about his son's life work had been completely transformed by a single song played on a simple wooden guitar. In 1991, more than 20 years after Jimmy's tragic death in London, Al finally shared the complete story during an extensive interview for a television documentary about his son's life and lasting musical legacy. "I spent years thinking my son made noise for a living," Al said, his voice still heavy with regret even after all that time had passed. "I wanted him to get a real job, to build something permanent and solid, something I could see and touch and understand with my own hands. Then he played me one song, just him and an acoustic guitar in our living room, and I realized he'd been building something incredibly important the whole time. He'd been building invisible bridges between people's hearts and their deepest pain, between their memories and their hopes for healing. I just couldn't see it because I was looking for the wrong kind of construction, expecting hammers and nails when he was working with emotions and melodies." The interviewer asked if Al had regrets. "I regret not listening sooner," Al admitted, "not just to his music, but to what he was trying to tell me through his music. He was saying, this is how I understand the world. This is how I process love and loss. This is how I keep Mother's spirit alive." And I kept telling him to turn it down. "What would you say to him now if you could?" the interviewer asked gently. Al was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window of the same house where Jimmy had played Little Wing all those years ago. "I'd say thank you," he finally answered, his voice soft with emotion. "Thank you for showing me that there are different ways to build something that truly lasts. His music is still here, still helping people deal with their pain, still carrying Lucille's love forward into the world. That's more permanent than any concrete building I ever constructed in my entire working life." The story of that November afternoon became part of the Hendrix legend, not because it revealed anything new about Jimmy's extraordinary musical genius, but because it illuminated the profound human cost of being misunderstood by those who love you most deeply. Al Hendrix had spent years dismissing his son's life work as elaborate, meaningless noise. One quiet song in a small living room had shown him it was actually the most sophisticated form of construction imaginable, building connections between human souls across time and space and loss, creating something that would outlast any physical building he'd ever worked on during his long construction career.